You're listening to Talking Africa, the podcast that gets behind the news from the continent. I'm Nick Norbrook. Welcome to the show. For all our reporting, virus-related or not, please head to theafricareport.com and sign up for our daily briefing. On the pod this week, a conversation between our editor-in-chief, Patrick Smith, and William Davison, the senior analyst for Ethiopia for the International Crisis Group. We've heard from William previously on the seismic domestic political changes underway in Ethiopia, but today the conversation is centred on the growing tensions between Ethiopia and Egypt over the filling of the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. The giant hydroelectric project, as seen from Addis Ababa, is the centrepiece of a decade or more of Ethiopian industrial policy. But from Cairo's perspective, it's seen as a unique threat to Egypt's water supply.
This week, there has been a couple of public statements from both the UN and China expressing concerns about the stalling of negotiations between Egypt and Ethiopia about the building and the filling of this dam. I wondered if you could explain why now and what's particularly triggered this.
What's happened is that in late February, the most recent talks sort of basically broke down. Ethiopia refused to sign an agreement that had been partly or largely drafted by the US and the World Bank after talks between Ethiopia, Egypt and Sudan. Subsequent to that, Ethiopia sort of reaffirmed its commitment to start filling the Renaissance Dam reservoir this year, or in fact as soon as the rains come, which could come in July. Now that position that Ethiopia is going to go ahead and start filling the reservoir without an agreement is one that Egypt opposes.
Right.
They have issued warnings, said that Ethiopia would be in breach of international legal obligations. Also, worryingly, talked about all options being on the table or language to that effect. And then the position that Ethiopia should not fill the reservoir, start filling the reservoir unilaterally, was also backed up by the US. So that was the situation that we've had since February. There's been no concerted talks since then. From the Ethiopian side, they have been engaged essentially in sort of domestic focused activity, reiterating the determination to proceed with the project and not to be sort of bullied off course. And then Egypt wrote a letter to the Security Council, the UN Security Council, expressing their concern, asking the international community to essentially back them up. And then there was the Ethiopian response to that. That's the sort of diplomatic situation, diplomatic activity that's led to this concern that you've mentioned from the UN and from China. And then the other thing that's worth mentioning is that on April the 10th, Prime Minister Abiy proposed a sort of interim agreement for the first 2 years of filling, but that was unfortunately declined by the Sudanese and Egyptian leaders. But now, just today and yesterday, it does look like soon we might have talks reconvening.
Right. Now, what about Sudan's position in this? Because they put out a statement this week as well that they're not happy with the standoff, if you like. What's their concern?
Well, the Sudanese concern is, well, the official concern is that, well, they rebuffed the offer of an interim agreement for the first 2 years of filling. Instead, they are saying that there's outstanding issues with regards to dam safety and being reassured or adequate studies being conducted on the sort of environmental and social impact of the dam. So while Sudan has generally backed the Renaissance Dam, generally backed the Ethiopian position, they sat out quite an aggressive Arab League resolution criticising Ethiopia recently, for example.
Right.
They have expressed these recent concerns, but their position is that they want to return to the trilateral talks and they want the parties to focus on striking a comprehensive agreement on the filling and operating rules and related matters on the Renaissance Dam. So that's the Sudanese position. Generally, they've been supportive, but they are it looks like they're trying to put a certain amount of pressure on Addis Ababa at the moment.
Right. I mean, out of all this, do you think that the end game is some completely new agreement on how the riparian nations operate with regard to the Nile? It seems that the current treaty, I think signed in 1959, governs Egypt's position, and what Ethiopia seems to be pushing for, and other Nile Basin countries seem to be pushing for, is a review of that to take into account all the demographic and economic and structural changes since then. Is that a realistic possibility now, or even an inevitability if this dispute drags on?
I mean, I think this is a very pertinent issue, but I think we also have to separate the issues into two. But they are related.
Right.
So Ethiopia's position on the Renaissance Dam negotiations is that they should be focused on the Renaissance Dam. They accuse Egypt and sort of by proxy the US of trying to secure Egypt's water quotas that they claim through this 1959 treaty.
Right.
So Ethiopia's position is that if we're going to discuss Nile water sharing, we do it through the forums that you're referring to, the Nile Basin Initiative, try and finalize and ratify and have the cooperative framework agreement come into force, a new multilateral treaty to govern the basin. But ultimately, that's not what's worrying everyone right now. The issue is, as described, Ethiopia is planning to start filling the reservoir. Egypt opposes it, and there's heightened tension over that issue. It's not realistic to think that this is going to be resolved in the next few months through the sufficient ratifications of the cooperative framework agreement, including Egypt and Sudan. But that is very much relevant context to that. Instead, I think if we're looking at a positive path through this and all this tension eventually leading to compromise, I think what we would have is some initial deal on the Renaissance Dam. Mm-hmm. Now, that could be on the first 2 years of filling, which is not controversial in hydrological terms. Yeah. And then the trilateral parties could then move on to a more comprehensive agreement on the GERD. Once that was up and running, and let's say things were institutionalized, it was a new spirit, it was a cooperative atmosphere. Well, if the parties manage to interact and come to some sort of consensus and compromise on this, hugely controversial Ethiopian dam, at least in the eyes of Cairo and Sudan, well, that would then put us in a good position to go to the much broader Nile Basin talks. But realistically, that's only going to be something which happens over the next few years. Not the next few months, let alone the next few weeks. And the next few weeks are actually looking quite critical with regards to the current diplomatic spat.
Yeah, I mean, there have been reports in some of the Arab papers about both sides getting, armed and ready, missiles being prepared on the Ethiopian side, guarding the dam and so on. And some people cast their minds back to the ill-fated Mohamed Morsi government and that weird recording of Egyptian generals standing around talking about aerial attacks on the dam and things like that. How seriously do you take all this stuff? Is it just propaganda on both sides, or is it one of those situations where too much nationalist tub-thumping and sort of militaristic stance could actually lead to an accident and things really spinning out of control?
I think undoubtedly the risks are there, right? It would be irresponsible for people looking at this situation to say, well, we have an issue which is of vital national interest for Ethiopia, right? They see this as the path out of poverty, this dam. And we know about Egypt's reliance on the Nile and the importance it attaches to concepts such as its historic rights, its quotas, water security. And we've also seen and heard these types of, frankly, belligerent statements and militaristic, nationalistic posturing from both sides, we cannot ignore it. And there is reason to think that, given the stances on both sides, with both positions being quite entrenched in support of these national security, national interests, there certainly is a danger of a sort of miscalculation here. You could speak to Ethiopians, diplomats, about the situation and say, well, Egypt's just bluffing. They're just trying to escalate diplomatically, put the pressure on, they will never do anything. From Cairo, you might hear that there's no way the Ethiopians are planning to fill the reservoir in Janai. They're not ready, construction's delayed, they've said this before. So there's this danger of miscalculation and bluffing, and it is a serious situation. But that's only one side of the story here, Patrick. It's almost impossible to think of some sort of incentive, some sort of benefit, some sort of long-term benefit for anyone here if this was to turn into a military, if this was turn into an active conflict.
Yeah.
What would be the Egyptian approach or objective? I mean, even some sort of fairly successful aerial bombardment of the dam presumably would only sort of put construction back a few years. The Ethiopians would come and start laying the concrete and all the rest of it again. And then there would be incredibly acrimonious relations and a huge hostility. And there would be no chance of cooperation for years. So it's not clear, how that would be in Egypt's interest, even if they were able to mount that sort of successful airstrike. And then think about the, diplomatic suffering that would ensue if they launched that sort of attack. Similarly, with any other form of aggressive action over this dam, it just means that the chances of cooperation are reduced, and in fact, it just becomes an even more acrimonious situation. Whilst Egypt's greatest fear is having, essentially an angry Ethiopia acting in a way which is, not sympathetic towards their interests, let's say. So we have to take seriously these types of statements and this type of manoeuvring. But ultimately, for everyone involved here, whether it's the Ethiopian governments and people, the Egyptians, the Sudanese, all of the other regional countries and the international actors, some form of negotiated solution here will make absolute sense for everyone. And just in terms of the current situation, like Ethiopia would want an agreement. They would want to proceed with an agreement because otherwise they will face diplomatic pressure. Egypt wants an agreement here because otherwise they look weak. They have warned Ethiopia not to proceed with filling unilaterally. So it's in Egypt's interest to get an agreement. And obviously Sudan is in the middle here. They want to cooperate, they want to benefit from the good, and they want risks to be reduced. So an agreement is in their interest as well. So all the incentives are stacked in favour of a negotiated settlement, and there's just no sane rationale of any sort for this escalating into conflict.
But meanwhile, both sides are ramping up the kind of diplomatic armories. I see that Egypt's undertaking some investments in Kenya and so on, and having bilateral talks with other countries in the region. Presumably, they want to exert pressure through diplomatic means first. But in terms of the settlement, there seems to be a big gap between, if you look at the issue of the filling of the dam, between the timeline talked about by Ethiopia and the timeline talked about Egypt. I mean, Egypt says, well, yeah, you could fill the dam over 15 years. Of course, Ethiopia is talking about a much quicker time frame, and as you say, starting this year. I mean, how do you begin to get a compromise between those two timelines? I mean, that looks difficult.
Well, it would be very difficult if those timelines were correct. Yep. They're not.
Right.
This has been wildly misreported.
Right.
I mean, the issue with the Renaissance Dam, the basic issue is that, yes, Ethiopia does theoretically want to fill it as quickly as possible to start generating power as quickly as possible.
Yep.